I want to just start off by thanking the Lopez Library for bringing me. Thank you to all of you for showing up tonight about this issue that I know many of you are just as, if not more, passionate about than I am. I also want to say that it's a real pleasure to come back to Lopez. I've been here since I was in high school in Bainbridge Island, and it's changed a bit. This church wasn't here before when I was here, but overall, it's nice to see that the flavor and the pace of life of Lopez feels pretty familiar to me. I was on the ferry on the way over, and sort of in an effort to connect to a Lopez Islander, I said, I grew up on an island too. I grew up on Bainbridge Island. And she said, that's not an island. It has a bridge. I stand corrected. Thank you so much, Ian, for having me here. I want to just say that the book I've just published, Orca, How We Came to Know and Love the Ocean's Greatest Predator, is a work of history. I am a historian, and it's very much about the intersection and relationship and transformation of our views of this species, but also how we've changed, especially in this region. It delves into issues that are really politically charged today, especially in and around the Salish Sea, the history and future of captivity, environmental damage, the campaign to return long captive orcas such as Lolita and Porky, and also played out very dramatically this summer in a way that's captured the attention of people around the world, not just in the region, the decline and perhaps impending extinction of the southern resident killer whale population. But I also had very personal reasons for writing this book. In the 1970s, my father helped capture orcas on both sides of the border. And during my childhood, late 70s, 80s, early 90s, I watched how he wrestled with the meaning of that and some of the growing guilt of that past, especially as orcas became increasingly iconic in the Pacific Northwest. And that was before, of course, the 2011 documentary Blackfish really focused the attention of many younger people on the question of captivity. Today, of course, orcas are, and it's no revelation to any of you for me to say this, orcas are a central part of our region's identity, our culture, certainly our tourist industry. The southern residents are, without question, the most studied population of cetaceans in history. They've been the most influential, as I hope I'll be able to show you here, most influential on us, on our environmental politics of any cetacean population. And make no mistake about it, they are on their way to extinction. So I set out with this project many years ago, before anyone was talking about the Kinder Morgan pipeline or J50 or J35. I set out to just make sense of how we got here and what it meant to us. Why did we go from fearing to loving this apex predator so quickly? What does that transformation say about them and about us? What is our moral obligation to the southern resident orcas now? These animals who helped change us all for the better, I've heard. And the key to this change, this rapid change, from hating to loving, was really the process by which we began to see them as individual creatures with their own connections, their own families, their own potential relations to us. And the driving force of that change, as uncomfortable as it is to explore now, I think, for us, was captivity itself, which transformed popular and scientific views of the species from the fearsome killer of the lore of mariners for centuries to the lovable orca. For centuries, it was those maritime industries, such as whaling, fishing, sealing, that had shaped the popular views of Orcinus orca. And most of us don't study or read Latin anymore, and so it's easy to forget that name in Latin is translated roughly as demon from the netherworld. People tend to think of orca as this sort of fuzzy, friendly name. Killer whale is an awful name, but actually killer whale sounds like an improvement on demon from the netherworld. Men who worked at the sea referred to them interchangeably through the 19th century, through the mid-20th century, interchangeably as killers and orcas. Orca is not a new term at all. Its meaning has changed, but the term is not new. Both terms, for men on the sea, conjured the image of a predator that competed for valued resources and potentially ate people. Writing in the 1870s, whaling captain Charles Scammon called orcas, quote, marine beasts who spread terror and death to every ocean. This is the guy that nearly killed off the eastern Pacific gray whales in their cabin movements. Decades later, the director of the Bronx Zoo declared, quote, the killer whale, or orca, is the demon of the seas. On the Pacific coast of North America, the indigenous whalers, such as the macaw and the chalmouth, sometimes hunted orcas, although the joke that several macaw elders told me is that this was mostly, his theory was this was mostly a way to get teenage boys to blow off steam, you know. Go chase the blackfish. I'll never catch them. Go chase the blackfish. Commercial whalers, settler whalers, generally ignored them. Partly because of their size, they didn't seem like a profitable target, but also because they were too fast to catch in ships under sail. But this was also true after World War II. As the world's and the Northwest whaling industry continued and even expanded. In contrast to Japanese and Norwegian whalers who killed thousands of orcas in the post-war period, I found actually only one case of Northwestern whalers taking one. I'm apologize that I sort of have to jump through a couple of slides that I put out of order. I'll come back to these in a second. This is a shot from the Cole Harbour whaling station in northern Vancouver Island. And this whale, the male offshore we know now, was killed apparently at the behest of a contract order by the Walt Disney Company in California that wanted to be able to stuff its body, preserve it, formaldehyde, and display it. This is in the mid-1950s, right before the opening of Disneyland. But the perception of killer whales as pests and potentially man-eating pests only grew in those years, in the post-war years. My favorite image of this is this. Everybody always looks at the headline, and I'm sure this is. we can't read this. Sexual practices of American women. Stag was sort of a men's adventure magazine, but also, to some degree, the progenitor of Playboy. And I always emphasized, when I was presenting to audiences such as when my mom came, to talks. I wasn't digging through this in my research. This was given to me by a friend. You can see here the image, these shipwrecked and strangely muscled and burly, shirtless men who are being tossed into the heartless ocean by this fearsome killer whale. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that lots of guys in the U.S. military read Stag magazine and likely saw this image. This issue came out in December of 1953, and it's just months after this issue of Stag magazine ran that the U.S. Navy actually participated in a pretty shocking act of violence against killer whales in the North Atlantic. And this was a series of sorties or expeditions by bored Navymen who had been requested by the Icelandic government to protect the herring fishery from orcas, which they believed were raiding the nets and were growing in numbers. And so on several occasions, actually in 54, 55, and 56 at least, the U.S. Navy conducted strafing runs and machine gun attacks on pods of orcas. In one attack alone, killing over 100 of them in the waters off of Iceland. Those kind of actions were hardly surprising. The Navy diving manual described killer whales as, quote, ruthless and ferocious, instructing divers to, quote, get out of the water immediately if any appeared. As one famed diving writer put it in his diving guide, quote, there is no treatment for being eaten by the orca, except reincarnation. It was a quirk of geography that made the Pacific Northwest the crucible of change in this perception and this relationship. The region's population centers, gotta make sure I've got the right slide here. Region's population centers sat on Puget Sound, Strait of Juan Fuca, and the Strait of Georgia, a trans-border marine ecosystem we now increasingly refer to as the Salish Sea. This was also a large portion of the range of what scientists would later label the southern resident killer whale population, 3 pods that we've called J, K, and L, that rely primarily on Chinook salmon runs. As late as 1880, they may have numbered 250 total, but industrial fishing brought changes to their ecosystem, brought falling Chinook salmon runs, as well as human violence. And when I say industrialized fishing, people often think, I believe, about fishing vessels, the mouth of the Columbia and Puget Sound. But I also want to point out a big part of the industrial fishing industry, and you sort of saw the slide at the beginning. Apologies for these being out of order. I just got a hold of these images from a friend right before I was sort of preparing this talk for you guys. In the early 20th century, this was an extremely common sight in Harrow Strait, Zaria Strait, off Point Roberts. And you can see these are industrial, corporate-owned traps that are actually long. Each one of these is longer than a football field, and they go out into the straits. And you can see how ruthlessly effective they would be in grabbing salmon runs, and certainly Chinook salmon runs. And you can see a close-up shot of Chinook, mostly Chinook that are being harvested. You get an idea of the scale of biomass that was taken out of the area. How many people here are aware of this history of industrial salmon traps? I'm curious. How many of you is it new? You can be proud of it. I find that, the reason I raise that is because I find that lots of the ecologists and the fisheries biologists who are setting policy don't often know this history. So it's worth reminding ourselves of the scale of how the ecosystem has been changed. And I should say too that this sometimes, orcas were sometimes caught up in this. There were several occasions where young orcas were either wandered into or got trapped in one of these fish traps and were shot and killed by those that ran in, by the guards that protected the traps. One of them was actually displayed after being dead at Luna Park in West Seattle. Also critical was the damage. I'll advance us here back to the Salish Sea. Sorry about that. Also critical was the damage done to the streams and the rivers that produced these Chinook runs. The Sacramento and the Columbia rivers were, of course, dammed up increasingly in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. In addition, of course, the Hanford nuclear site dumped nuclear waste into the Columbia River, making it, according to the U.S. government in 1966, quote, the most radioactive river in the world. All this change, especially the cutting off or reduction of those runs in Sacramento and Columbia, all this change likely drove the southern residents to spend more time foraging in the Salish Sea, Puget Sound, and the fish off the Fraser River, where fishermen, the growing number of commercial fishermen there, regarded them as threats to salmon, possibly threats to themselves, and frequently shot them. It's a very common occurrence and report at the time of fishermen taking shots at and even killing orcas in the first half of the 20th century and well into the post-war period. For their part, scientists based in the area, and particularly the scientists based at Seattle's Marine Mammal Biological Laboratory, this is what's now the National Marine Mammal Laboratory run by NOAA. At the time, it was the only lab in North America devoted to marine mammal research. But that research was entirely based on the kill and dissect method of science. Scientists at the lab believed orcas, or feared orcas, were not just threats to salmon runs, but also believed that they were depleting the northern fur seal population, which the lab ran in conjunction with the corporations in Seattle, ran an annual harvest of killing and processing northern fur seals in Alaska for their meat and especially for their fur. And so their concern was that orcas off the California coast as well as in Alaska ate up the young seals. Through the 1960s, researchers based in Seattle, regularly harpooned and killed orcas off the California coast, sometimes off the Washington and Oregon coast, to study their stomach contents, essentially to assess if and how many of these fur seals they were eating. In 1961, the Seattle Times celebrated one such kill in which the lab's esteemed scientist, Bellevue native Victor Sheffer, described orcas, quote, as, quote, bloodthirsty. And this goes on through the 1960s. Here's a shot of one of these whales killed off of Morro Bay in California. This is a researcher, Oregon-born researcher who was working at the Seattle lab at the time. Things went even further in British Columbia, where in 1960 and 61, officials were trying to figure out a way to protect the sports fishing industry, especially around the Campbell River, from the threat, the scourge they thought of blackfish eating up the prized spring salmon, the Chinook salmon. They decided that after discussing whether they should use mortars or bomb them, what was the best solution, they decided the most reasonable idea was to mount a 50 caliber machine gun just north of Campbell River to shoot orcas. And the only reason that they don't fire the gun is that someone came to the reasonable conclusion that the firing of the 50 caliber machine gun might also scare off the sports fishermen and the tourists. Reasonable, I think. This is what's going on in the 50s and the 60s. But at the height of this violence and potential violence, and I want to emphasize, this could have gone a different way. History is full of contingencies, and in BC, the Fisheries Department had just recently rid BC waters of the basking shark population by literally driving into them with ships mounted with bow blades, slicing the basking sharks, obliterating the population, which has never recovered in 70 years. Could have gone a different way. But at that moment, at the height of the violence, live capture sparked a transformation. And it all began by accident. In the summer of 1964, the Vancouver Aquarium set up an expedition at Saturna Island to harpoon and kill an orca, simply to use its body as a model for a sculpture that was going to be placed in its new foyer. They fired the harpoon into a young orca, but it didn't die. And when they realized it was going to live, they led it to Vancouver. The animal lived just 2 months, became known as Moby Doll. No one got in water with it, perished the thought. It's still considered a fearsome creature. I mean, they're afraid to even administer medicine. They literally administered medicine with a 10-foot pole because they didn't want to get any closer to this creature. But eventually its handlers and its trainers realized, this is a different kind of behavior than we expected. It wasn't trying to attack anyone. It fascinates people. But Moby Doll dies just a couple months in captivity. And then the key transformative moment occurs the following summer, the summer of 1965. And it's related to this man. So that the center is this man, Ed Griffin, who is holding a harbor seal there, as you can see. Griffin was an entrepreneur who had opened an aquarium on the Seattle waterfront during the 1962 World's Fair. And he became really fascinated after he'd had a couple of encounters as a child with orcas, but he became really fascinated after one particularly close encounter on a rowboat, and he became obsessed with the idea of befriending an orca. At first, hoped that he could get them to interact with him from boats. That didn't seem to be happening, and he thought about the possibility of corralling and capturing one and befriending it that way, like a pet, like a domesticated pet. They spent years, actually, trying to figure out a way to do this. How do you capture one of these animals? Some people thought he was completely insane. They thought he'd be torn limb from limb if they ever did get one of them to interact with. Finally, in the summer of '65, a large male orca was captured accidentally by, to be blunt, two Canadian fishermen who were drunk and sleeping in their bunks and left their nets out. And the nets drifted up sort of against a rocky outcropping in a reef. They woke up the next morning and there were actually two orcas behind their nets, a young calf and a large male. The calf eventually got away, but Griffin acquired the male and built a floating pen. This is in right off of Namu, BC, and towed the whale hundreds of miles south. In the process, this whale becomes famous in a town named Namu. And newspapers throughout BC, Seattle area, but also around the world cover the story of Namu's passage southward. I think I'm shocking. This is the Deception Pass Bridge. The crowd gathered on the Deception Pass Bridge caused about a 12-hour traffic delay. I want to point out, in 1965, the ideas of child safety were very different. If any of you have ever seen the Deception Pass Bridge, the fact that people are just holding their kids over the side of there makes me shake my head. Here's a crowd greeting Namu's arrival in Seattle. After several weeks of talking about the possibility of venturing into the water with Namu, Griffin finally took the plunge, and people were fascinated and stunned. The whale scientists were stunned when Griffin it wasn't just that he wasn't attacked by Namu, that Namu allowed him to swim with him, allowed him to start touching him, even rubbing him and scratching him, and people were mesmerized by this. Eventually, the two began performing together the first choreographed Orca performances off the Pier 56, which is right next to the ferry terminal in Seattle. This image here was just unthinkable before. Whenever I show people this image, they sort of assume, oh, that's in SeaWorld, right? Or that's a trainer. And this is the first images people saw of a human being in the water with this presumably ferocious apex predator. People were wondering, why isn't it attacking? It could. What's going on here? Millions would read about the relationship that Griffin was forming with Namu in a now famous March 1966 article in National Geographic called Making Friends with a Killer Whale. If any of you are familiar with Ken Balcom and his Orca survey of San Juan Island, it was Balcom in his mid-20s reading about Griffin and Namu in National Geographic that began this transformation in his view of this predator. And many of the scientists I interviewed talked about that article as being really important to their interest. So millions read that, millions more would see a fictionalized version of Namu in this relationship in, she was showing me this first. This is a shot from the beginning of Namu performing off Pier 56. Many more saw this film that came out in the summer of 1966 by the producer of Flipper. It's not great, but it was filmed partly in Friday Harbor, so it's pretty fascinating to get a glimpse of the thinking at the time and such. By the time it came out in the summer of '66, Namu himself had died. We now know about the toxins and the sewage in Elliott Bay. But his impact, both through film and other influences, Namu's impact was really twofold. First, the public really marveled in a way that I think is hard for us to step back and understand now and reimagine now. But the public marveled at his gentleness with Griffin. And second, his popularity convinced oceanarians along the coast, the West Coast, around North America, eventually around the world, that they needed their own Namu. They needed one of these potentially signature animals. This is a moment when we start seeing orcas as a prime attraction that could be even bigger than the bottlenose dolphin. And in the following years, Griffin supplied many of these, most of these, as he began capturing orcas in Puget Sound, including SeaWorld's first Shamu, which was literally, SeaWorld had asked if it could use the name Nemo for their whale, because Nemo was so famous. Griffin refused, and so they came up with She-Nemo, or Shamu. Captive orcas drew crowds, giving most visitors their first close-up view, not just of killer whales, but of a larger cetacean than the bottlenose dolphin. Their first, I know that we all now accept the definition of them as the biggest dolphin, but for people at the time, they're thinking about this as seeing a whale. And also, in the process of that, many of these people's, most of these people's first sense of orcas, of whales as individual creatures with personalities. By 1970, some 30 million people had seen captive killer whales. 30 million. And they weren't just spectators. Many were scientists with their first access to live orcas. It always bears repeating that there was no live orca research prior to this. It was only on dead orcas. Scientists did not study them. And certainly they didn't have the ability to study them up close. This is when, for example, scientists are able to confirm for the first time in history that orcas use biosonar, or that how their diving physiology worked. And they didn't just study these things. They also came to know them as individuals with personalities, which often challenged scientific assumptions of animals as being driven, mostly by genetic or evolutionary imperatives. These personalities helped transform many of the scientists, and one of them, probably the most influential whale, I've argued elsewhere, the most influential cetacean in human history, was named Scanna. Scanna was captured to the west of Seattle in February of '67, sold to the Vancouver Aquarium. It was really the first whale that was displayed at the Vancouver Aquarium itself. And Scanna didn't just draw visitors, she captivated a young researcher named Paul Spall, a human, a brain researcher from New Zealand who didn't really know anything about cetaceans prior to this position in Vancouver. And he had come there initially to do a pretty simple series of tests about the vision of dolphins and orcas, to assess her visual acuity. And Scanna figured it out. It was a really simple test. She had to push a lever to identify which panel had one line and which panel had two lines. And the way that they assessed her acuity is by shifting the distance between the lines to figure out at what point she could no longer distinguish that there was not two lines. She learns it. She starts performing it. She starts performing it very correctly. Repeatedly. He's getting all the data he needs, just like the scientist wants to. And then one day, Scanna starts answering wrong. And not just kind of wrong, all wrong, entirely wrong, totally wrong. And this, it's essentially impossible statistically if she's randomly guessing. So what the heck's going on here? She's learned how to do it. What is she doing? It's a puzzle to him. And one day, he's trying to figure out what this means. This is why I have this chair up here as a problem. And he's sitting on the side of Scanna's pool. He's got his bare feet in the pool. I'm not going to take my shoes off, but you can imagine. And he's watching Scanna swim these slow circles. And he's wondering, what is this creature, this killer whale, that won't cooperate with my test? What does this mean? Can it really mean that she's grumpy and refusing to cooperate? It's strange. And as he's sitting there puzzling, "Don't puzzle him sore," to quote Dr. Seuss, Scanna swims closer and opens her mouth and rakes his feet with her teeth. And he reacts, I'll paraphrase, what the heck was that? That giant predator just almost grabbed my toes. But that was strange. He finally found the courage to put his toes back in. Now, bear in mind, he'd never gotten in the water with her. He never swam with her. So trainers did, but he didn't. And she does it again. What is going on here? Finally, he puts it back in. 11 times this dance occurs. 11 times he pulls his feet out. And on the 12th pass, he finally finds the courage to keep his feet in, despite the raking. And Scanner stops. And Spawn looks at this whale swimming around the pool and thinks, what the heck just happened? Am I the subject? Is she the scientist? Was she just experimenting with my fear? This experience is mind-blowing to him. It transforms him, it politicizes him, in a process, granted he was already beginning to go through. But Spawn, because of this encounter and his other interactions with Scanner, becomes an opponent, a critic of captivity as he starts to think about this sentient personality that's in this pool challenging him, but also goes on to become a pioneer in killer whale research, as well as a key figure in the anti-whaling campaign, which I'll come back to. I'll come back to his role in that. But by 1969-70, he's already thinking about how do you actually observe and research orcas in the wild. While that's happening, a pivotal event, a now infamous event, takes place in Puget Sound, when in August 1970, Griffin's company, called Nano Incorporated, captures, corrals what we now know as virtually the entire southern resident orca population off of Ruby Island. Now, it bears repeating that, first of all, there's no regulation at all, U.S. or state regulation, limiting the capture of orcas. And it's also worth knowing that nobody knew these were what we now call southern resident orcas, that they were a resident population. Having said that, it's still a deeply traumatic event to the whales and a traumatic event to the people that witnessed it. Now Griffin immediately orders half of the whales released, but the half that are released remain in the area right next to the nets as sort of a poignant reminder of their connection to the whales that are behind the nets. And this happens in the summer, so there were lots of boaters and there were lots of locals and visitors in Penn Cove. One of those interested in seeing this capture was a Lopez Island resident named James Scripps, a publisher, who had a private plane. He flew over Penn Cove and later told the Seattle Times that the image of the whales separated by the nets was terrible and sickening. Some locals on Whidbey Island were so angry that they tried to free the orcas by cutting the nets at night. But in the tides, the nets collapsed, causing 3 calves to drown. Griffin and his partner, Don Goldsberry, kept several whales for sale before releasing the rest. Among those they kept was a young female who'd go to the Miami Aquarium and become known as Lolita, still there today. When the deaths were discovered, the dead calves had been concealed, the public backlash contributed to a push at the state and federal level to protect, not really to protect orcas in the way we would acknowledge today, but to regulate capture. In 1971, Washington State passes a regulation. It's going to continue to allow them to be captured, but under state supervision. And the following year, the U.S. Congress passes the landmark, the transformative Marine Mammal Protection Act, which has no equivalent in Canada, I always like to point out, nothing even close. Meanwhile, the Save the Whales movement was emerging, and it had ties, as I hinted earlier, to orca captivity in ways that people often forget now. In 1973, after meeting Farley Moa, the author of A Whale for the Killing, was on his book tour. Paul Spall lobbied Vancouver's new Greenpeace organization to turn its attention to whaling. A lot of people assume Greenpeace, that's what it does, right? Protest whaling. Well, it actually been founded in 1771 as an anti-nuclear group. And its leader, Bob Hunter, wasn't terribly interested in whaling. Why should I care about whaling? Why should I care about these animals? Spall tells him, look, just come with me to the Vancouver Aquarium, meet Scanna. We'll see what you think then. So Spall and Hunter are allowed to come to the Vancouver Aquarium to conduct a press conference, because Spall was about to launch a campaign in Japan to stop Japanese whaling. And he brought Hunter along. Spall, even though it's been several years since he's seen Scanna, crouches down by the pool, and Scanna seems to greet him as if she knows him. And then he invites Hunter to come along, Hunter, the leader of Greenpeace. And Hunter's nervous. I mean, people forget how big and formidable these creatures are. Right? You know, Hunter doesn't really want to get this close to this giant predator with wolf-like teeth. Right? And he sort of comes a little closer and he reaches down. And, oh, that's nice. She's let me pat him. That's lovely. Sort of gets a little closer. Gets a little closer, and like this. And then right after this moment, Scanna submerges and comes back out of the water and grabs hold of Hunter's hand. You know, gently but not so gently. And holds him there. But to him, it felt like minutes, probably 5-10 seconds. And then she released him and went back in the water. This is a moment that will live in Greenpeace legend and lore forever. I mean, for Hunter, he described it as the equivalent of dropping LSD. He described it, I think, tellingly as his foundational encounter with wild nature. But I'd like to point out to people that that's a trained behavior. It's a trained behavior that Scanna had learned from trainers. I mean, wild killer whales don't come along and grab people's heads gently and then go back in the water. And as uncomfortable as this connection is for many of us, I mean, this encounter is only possible in this context of Scanna being there and him having access to it. And what's the significance of this? Well, Hunter goes on to become, in many ways, a messiah for the anti-whaling movement, as much like Paul Spall. He and Spall lead the organization's first anti-whaling confrontation with the Soviet whaling fleet in June 1975. They don't just make headlines, they get footage. They get live footage of the Soviet hunt and footage of them in Zodiacs trying to intervene and protect sperm whales. This makes it onto evening news, Walter Cronkite's broadcast. Why is this so influential? Why is this so important? A lot of people say, well, it's the first time anyone ever saw whaling, right? No, it wasn't. There's been whaling footage around since there's been footage, and there's been film. There's two things that were different about the Greenpeace competition that made it such a mind bomb, as Bob Hunter described it. The first one was, it was the very first time there was footage of human beings trying to intervene to stop, to protect whales. And the second, I would argue, is that unlike that earlier footage in the 30s, the 40s, and 50s that people could see, for the first time, people were seeing these whales being hunted as individuals, and individuals with families. And we now know these sperm whales that were being hunted were groups of related females and their calves. Individual creatures. We take that for granted now, but that was not something the way people saw cetaceans before. And in fact, in BC, at that very moment, these very years, I should say, a researcher named Michael Big was making a breakthrough that would take that change to a new level, especially for killer whales. Working partly with captive orcas, and this is Big designing a radio harness for a captive orca named Haida at Sealand of the Pacific in Oak Bay near Victoria. Working partly with these captive whales, he developed a system for identifying individual animals by their dorsal fins and their distinctive saddle patches. And he he argues that this is a system by which we can identify individuals and their relationships to one another without catching them, just by looking at them. However, this is really made possible by one experiment he conducts on a whale that's captured in 1973 and then released, named K1 or Taku, who, big, hard as this is to say today, cuts 2 notches into Taku's dorsal fin to prove that year after year after year, the marks on dorsal fins would stay the same. You could identify them in that way. And the reason that's transformative is because other scientists, US scientists, scientists affiliated with SeaWorld, were arguing that the only way to catch them, the only way to identify them was to catch them and mark them. Even if we didn't keep them all, you had to catch them. They burn marks into them with dry ice to try to brand them. They experimented by burning marks, numbers, and sort of alphanumerics into them with lasers. But ultimately, it's a big system that prevails. Shows that if you read their bodies, if you read these orcas' bodies on their own terms, it's actually the best way to identify them. And this enables, in time, enables Big and his colleagues to identify individuals, and now we know matrolines and these pod structures in a way that was unimaginable at the time. The profound change in public views, and scientific views, certainly, but public views, was revealed in 1976 when SeaWorld, which had bought Griffin's aquarium and its whale capturing in Seattle. SeaWorld conducted what I can only describe as an ill-advised capture attempt in southern Puget Sound. I couldn't sell this as a novel, and I don't have to because it's really happened. But it occurred within sight of the state capitol in Olympia, where legislators had literally just days before been discussing the possibility of making Puget Sound a whale sanctuary. And SeaWorld conducts a capture within sight of the Capitol building. It also came just days before a previously scheduled Orca symposium that was to be held at Evergreen State University, which is literally just right next door. The public was outraged, and protesters besieged the capture site. One of the Republican Governor Dan Evans's top aides, Ralph Monroe, future Secretary of State, was actually on a boat and witnessed the capture and was infuriated and pushed the state government towards suing the federal government and SeaWorld into ultimately ending captures in the state. Think about that. The state which had previously seen orcas as predators and as vermin that might take salmon is now suing the federal government to protect them, suing SeaWorld to protect them. This is kind of affection that had been generated in the region. It's no surprise, I think, that when the following year Paramount releases a film called Orca, Killer Whale, trying to capitalize on the blockbuster phenomenon of Jaws. It doesn't do well, and especially doesn't do well in the Pacific Northwest. This is inexplicable. I mean, it was an unrecognizable image of the killer whale, right? Chasing Richard Harris to the ends of the earth, biting off Bo Derek's leg. That doesn't make any sense. By the way, for those of you who haven't seen this is 2 hours you can never get back. So only do it for research purposes if you have to. But I also want to emphasize that as absurd as this seemed with the affection that was growing in the Northwest toward the killer whale, that change hadn't come everywhere. In 1980, the Soviet Union shocked many by reporting that it had killed 916 orcas in just the last year's Antarctic hunt. And it also noted that of the females that were examined, and not all of them were examined, but of those that were examined, 141 of them were pregnant. For researchers in the Pacific Northwest who have painstakingly identified individual whales, their family structures, and their matrolines, this kind of carnage was just unimaginable. Now these are not just whales, these are individuals who are being killed with their families. The next year, Big and other experts attended the International Whaling Commission, convincing it to stop the harvesting of orcas until at least population assessments could be done. And the next year, 1982, the IWC passed a whaling moratorium to stop, to initiate a virtual stop in commercial whaling. By then, in the early 80s, orcas had become icons in the Pacific Northwest already. Whale watching companies were already appearing. Northern Vancouver Island, certainly some early starts in Friday Harbor. And officials, state and federal officials who had once targeted the species were now charged with protecting it. No one typified this extraordinary shift more than Victor Sheffer. Remember that guy I quoted earlier, the scientist, the Bellevue native and scientist who had described killer whales and bloodthirsty. He had spent his whole career supervising the killing of marine mammals for science, in particular the northern fur seal harvest. Like other researchers, he thought about orcas as essentially pests, as vermin for more, that took away more valuable resources, but also specimens if they were killed. But Sheffer too had lived through this change. And how did he explain this in 1994 when he was interviewed? Quote, seeing them in aquariums individualized these creatures, you see. They were no longer just whales in the abstract. They were families. When Sheffer was interviewed in the mid-90s, the southern resident killer whales seemed to be enjoying a recovery, nearing 100 individuals by the late 1990s. That trend has not continued. In the past 2 decades, as the human population of the Salish Sea has boomed, as economic activity and infrastructure has increased, the southern residents have dwindled. We've just watched it happen this summer to the horror of most of us, shrinking from 76 to 74 animals. And although we enjoy them on both sides of the border, the southern residents, they rely primarily on the Chinook salmon runs of the Fraser River now. That's their main source of food. Those Chinook are vanishing, and the Canadian government may yet, despite the recent ruling, may yet expand the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which it now owns, which will threaten this last food source, not just in the possibility of spills and marine noise, but also in all the infrastructure that has to cross the watershed of the Fraser River. And with it, it'll threaten this population of orcas who, I would argue, not only taught us to love their species, not only taught us to love cetaceans more than people could have imagined in the 1960s, but also helped us rethink our own priorities in this region. So we have to ask ourselves, on both sides of the border, and if I have any message I want to take politically in talks like this, it's to get people to really think in a transborder way about these questions. Because we have to ask ourselves on both sides, what do we owe them? Do we have ultimately a moral debt to the southern residents? And does that history, the history that I just showed you, help provide us some idea, not just of how we came to love them, but how we may help to heal them, and in the process, help heal ourselves and find some kind of path to redemption and maybe a bit of forgiving. And I'll close with this final image here that's a bit about the book's theme of forgiveness and healing. All right, that's all I have.